All right, we're back. We are MAPD724. That's Advanced iOS Programming at Centennial in the winter 2018 semester, and we are week 2, part 1 of our broadcast. And we're going to do SpriteKit today, which is a little bit different than you've done. So last week we talked about how to use core graphics and to draw some stuff. By the way, I did correct the problem that I had last week. The problem was, it was so stupid. It was that I didn't put any constraints on the stuff that you drew. So when you draw something, you still got to put constraints. And if you put constraints, everything works great. So that's the problem. And I think I did, yeah. And if I didn't, I'll do it later. Anyways, so this week is going to be different. So I'm opening up Xcode projects. I'm going to go with a new Xcode project here. And it's going to be this game, right? So normally we go to single view applications. The first time we're doing this one, right? And we're going to click next. All right, and I'm going to call this, of course, MAPD724-Winter 2018, Lesson 2. Okay, so that's, you know which one it is. Now it says, what kind of game technology do you want to use? Notice there is SpriteKit, there is SceneKit, and there is Metal. So SpriteKit primarily for 2D games. That's what we use, right? It's really robust, got lots of stuff that you can do with it. SceneKit more for 3D games, right? And Metal, you can actually program. It's a shading language that you can use, tap into, similar to using OpenGL and GLSL. You know, a lot of times you use Metal for more advanced games. Okay, so I don't care about integrating gameplay kit. I'm not going to do that right now. I just want to click on SpriteKit and then click next. All right, I'm saving my project. I'm definitely going to make a Git repository. I'm going to click create. Okay, a couple things to note. I will on Slack. Let's go to Slack for a second. Oh, yeah, there's a nice picture. Someone of our students. And if you go on Slack, here's Kilissa for a second. Under General, I'm going to drag and drop some assets for you guys. Now, these are the same assets, funny enough, that I use for other game programs that I do with some minor modifications. And why? So why am I giving it to you? Because I'm going to make the same game. And someone kind of went up on my website and said, hey, the game is okay, but the clouds are too big, right? But the thing is, that's the game. That wasn't my game, right? This isn't my game. This is a game that I've been using since 2011 to talk about games, right? It's like my Hello World. Remember I talked about Hello Worlds? MailPilot is my Hello World for games across all platforms. If I can do MailPilot on iOS, I can do it on Android. I can do it on with JavaScript. I can do it in any system. Unity. I've done it in Unreal. It's the same thing I do all the time. And so why I do it? Because not because I'm not inventive or creative. It's because once you know how to do a game, a 2D game in one system, and you understand how to do it, and when you figure out how to do it on another system, then you know how to make any game in that system for the most part. You actually understand the way games are made. You can't do everything. Every game system is different. So I have these assets, which I'm going to compress. I'm just going to compress the assets. And I'm just going to drag and drop the assets onto Slack. So please grab them from Slack for today. So MAPD 2017. You can upload those things. Now, when you grab these assets, they're just assets for this game for today. Okay? We're going to use it for this week and some part of next week. Okay? Because this making a game within 1 week is impossible. Okay? Just for people who know that, right? If you're going to make a game and you're going to try and make a game in a week, not going to happen, right? Hey, by the way, how are you guys doing with your game, your slot machine? Is it done? Right? Yeah, right? It's not as easy as it looked, maybe. Hey, Tom, that really looked easy. I can totally knock that off and get it done. And then you try it, and you try and copy the JavaScript and convert it to Swift, and it's like, it doesn't work. And that's part of the lesson. The lesson is, hey, I have some pseudocode, and I want to bring it into Swift. I want to learn Swift. I want to make a small game, very simple game with buttons that we kind of know how to do already. How do I do it? So I'm going to go back at some point in this session and check you guys and see how your UI designs are going, and I'll give you some time today to complete them. All right, but here back in Xcode, I have this new project. I'm going to change the display name to MailPilot. That's what my project is going to be displaying when it's on my device. I want to also change it from an iPhone 8 Plus. Let's change it to something a little smaller because let's go to with an iPhone SE for now. It's a little different. And it'll work on any device, by the way, but there's going to be some issues. Also, make sure you sign into your profile, all that stuff. I'm targeting 11.2 from a deployment target perspective. You can target an earlier version if it's better for you. Here's what I'm not going to allow. I'm going to allow portrait, but no landscape. So please turn off landscape left and right. So my game is not going to be working in landscape mode, right? It's important to do this now because if you try doing something different later, it won't work. If you unzip your assets, I have my assets folder here from week 2. And you can see that I have some assets here. And what I want you to do first and foremost is get the images, these images here, and just drag and drop this whole images folder into XC assets. So click on XC assets, and then grab this whole images folder and grab it in there. And this is going to give you all the assets for the game, right? And if you notice, there's a cloud, which is really ugly. There is an island, which is pixelated. There are some buttons, which we may use. There's an ocean, which we're going to be talking about. And there's a few versions of the plane. By the way, the plane, if you notice, there's a plane, and there's plane 1, plane 2. We can use these different planes to create a small animation later on. Won't be today. Today, basics, okay? So we need that. And we're also going to eventually have some sounds for the game. So under audio, don't drag it in here, drag it in here, right? So take these audio files. Now, here's the thing. iOS loves MP3, doesn't like OGG. So take the MP3 files only and drag them into the project. Okay. There it is. I'm just making the project assets. We have everything we can do. The next part is the fonts. I want to make a custom font. I want to use a custom font for my start screen. So I'm going to have several screens. I'm going to have a start screen in this game. I'm going to have a gameplay scene. I'm going to have an end scene. Okay? Just like we normally have, right? Start screen is most like a splash screen that comes up. It says, maybe welcome, one of that, press play or press the screen to start something, right? So I'm going to have a special font. It's called Doc51. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to do here with this one when you unzip it or uncompress it. Right-click, and what you want to do is you want to open it on your Mac with FontBook. Do this first. When you do that, it's going to install the font on your Mac, okay? If you don't do this, then you won't have access to adding it in. It won't show up in the operating system. So that's the first thing. After it's been installed, you follow the instructions, and I'll show you how it looks. It kind of opens up this little app here, and then you click Install Font. Now, I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it now. Next, so I've installed it, and now I want to drag and drop this font into my application. Okay, so I do it. And notice that it kind of puts it in there, and make sure it says, when you create groups or whatever, and then click Finish. Now, there's some other work we have to do for the font. Fonts are a little tricky to make work with devices, and we never did custom fonts before, but there's some stuff we have to do. So let's fix the font problem first. On the left, when you click on the font, my font is called Doc51, and it kind of gives you this funky little different kind of font, right? So it's not a standard font at all, which makes it more interesting for you. Now you can use other kinds of fonts in your application, not just the regular fonts, right? On the right, under Target Membership, okay, under Target Membership, please click on MAPD724, whatever you call your project. That's the first step. Okay, if you don't do that, then the Doc51 will not show up. It'll show up some other font, right? Because it doesn't understand what it is, right? So first step is you add it to your font book for your Mac. It's got to be on your Mac. Second step is you've got to put it into your application, and then what you're going to do is you're going to add it to your membership, right? So that it's part of your application. Okay, now this step is really weird, right? You got to go into your info.p list. This is the first time. And on the bottom here, right, you notice that there's all these different things you can do, right? Launch screens and blah, blah. This is almost like your properties for the entire application that you're writing. I'm going to right-click down here, and I'm going to add a row, right? And if you notice here, it's going to be, I'm going to type in font, and it's going to say fonts provided by application. I want you to add this in. Okay, so fonts provided by application. Underneath that, you're going to expand this, right? And on the right-hand side, right, you're going to type in doc51.ttf and press enter. So what this does is it basically says, hey, I'm going to register my font. It's going to upload it to my application, my app, so I can use it. Otherwise, it will never show up. Never. So a few steps there. So the first step we did was we added to the font book, the font book and the Mac. We dragged and dropped it over here, making sure that the membership, the target membership was, like I said before, the application that's installed, right? And then we went to the info.plist and we right-clicked and added a row, which created this area where I typed in fonts provided by application. It kind of popped up. I expanded it and went down to here and put doc51.ttf, the same name as the font. Yeah, that's the steps. That should take care of it for the most part. If you have an older version of iOS, or if you're using another Xcode version, it may work differently. Okay, so that's the first one. Now to test this, there's a couple of different things here that we've never seen before, okay? One thing is, okay, we still got our app delegate.swift, so this is the same. Nothing's changed here. We still have our whole application lifecycle. We also have a main storyboard. Here's our main storyboard, which we may end up using later on. I'll talk about this and what's the advantage of using the main storyboard in combination with what we're doing, okay? There's an advantage. We'll talk about this. Then there is a this new thing called GameViewController.swift. Now, this is something we have to talk about. Let's go over it. So one, it uses UIKit. It uses SpriteKit. It uses GameplayKit, right? So a couple of additional libraries that we've never seen before. We do have a view did load, but what happens is it checks to see if the view, the main view, is, which is equal to a self.view as skView, if it exists. It checks to see if that's true. And if it's true, it says, let the scene itself be this new thing called SKScene. Okay. What the heck is a scene? All right. Remember, we're talking about SpriteKit. So I want you to think about each screen that you're going to see in your game as a scene. That's what it's called, right? And what I want to do is I want to load the scene. And the first one that they gave us is something called GameScene.swift. This is the one we're going to go to. So GameViewController, all it does right now, it does two things. It adds in the ability for us to show our frame rate. So show FPS shows us how many frames per second. How many times does my screen refresh every second on my device, right? And it shows the total number of nodes on the screen. Okay, that's what it does, those two things. Okay, and then there's a bunch of other things. Did receive memory warning, prefers status bar hidden. Notice this is true. So we hide the status bar because in games, we don't want to see a status bar, right? We want to hide the status bar. I want to take up the full screen. And it says, support interface orientations. We say all but upside down. We can also change this physically, but I've already done it in my manifest, so it doesn't really matter, right? And should auto-rotate bool? Well, we definitely want to auto-rotate if we turn it the way around, but it won't. It will stay style. We want to make it stay solid with our demonstration here, okay? Okay, let's test this thing the way it is. I want to see what it is first and what's happening. One thing to note is that there is a GameScene.sks file. There's this GameScene.sks, and there's also this GameScene.swift. I want you to think about those two files as one. You can't do one without the other. You need both. The GameScene.sks, it looks very similar to a type of storyboard, okay? But it's a special storyboard that we use for games. Okay, that's what it is. And notice it's calibrated here. It talks about how many points and all this kind of stuff. Okay, that's what the GameScene.sks is, right? SpriteKit scene. That's what it stands for, right? And then there's a GameScene.swift. I want you to think about this as the code behind file. This is the file that's linked to the GameScene.sks file that drives the file, makes it work. Okay? You can't just have a game scene without some kind of code. So we don't code like normal inside of a view controller. Okay, we don't do that. We can do some coding in there, But if you notice, game view controller inherits from UI view controller. So it's kind of a type of special UI view controller, right? And that means you can have a main storyboard as well. So there's main storyboard. You can put something in there as well, right? There can also be a launch screen if you really want to. You can make a special launch screen when the app loads, just like we've done before. All the regular stuff, plus additional scenes. And there's one other file that I want to point your attention to right now, something called actions.sks. This is not what you think it is. If you notice, what you have is a little animation view of the different kinds of actions that you can do. Again, we're not going to talk about this week, probably. We'll probably talk about this a little bit next week, where you can actually create animations and actions by dragging and dropping. All right, so far, Xcode has been used to make applications. Now, for the first time, we're making a real game. You've been given a game assignment, but the game assignment is with regular application, right? You don't need SpriteKit to do your assignment. But if you wanted to, you could, right? Because here you have complete control over what's being drawn because everything is a sprite. Okay, first, many of you probably don't know even what a sprite is. I want you to think about it as a bitmap, a picture, an image, right? And usually what a bitmap is a series of, like we talked about last week, right? Just as a review, a bunch of bits of color, pixels that kind of go across. That's what really a bitmap is, a bunch of pixels. And pixels have a couple of pieces of information with them, some kind of location and a color, right? We talked about that last week. So there's nothing different about this bitmap. It's just called a sprite because we're going to do stuff with it. We're going to use it in our game. We're going to animate it. We're going to do a bunch of stuff with it. The kind of animation we're going to do is called frame-based animation. Okay, so I have an image, and then I'm going to change it to something else. And I'm going to change it to something else. And I'm going to do it so fast, 60 frames per second, that it's going to look like it's moving, but actually it's not. It's just flipping. I'm just changing the images over and over again. Frame-based animation. There's different kinds of animation. That's one type. The other one is keyframe animation. That's a totally different kind of thing. Well, you can use it both together. And others. There's other kinds of animation too. Animation that includes some kind of morph targets, for example. Morph targets means I have an initial stage or state for an animation. A picture looks like one way. Then I have the final image, and then it morphs from one to the other. Right? In other words, it linearly interpolates between one and the other. So it kind of converges on it, and I can give it a time frame. I can say, okay, make it change from this picture to this picture, but do it over 2 seconds. So it's going to go like imagine, look, you have a face and it turns into a cat, right? Like that kind of thing. That's a different kind of animation. You can do that too. So that's kind of like using morph targets. And then there's, of course, bone-based animation, a rig, some kind of bones that go behind the animation that we can program to do more complex animations. And typically we don't do that with 2-dimensional games. We do it with 3-dimensional games, more complex games. So we're not going to probably get into that this semester, right, for you guys. All right, so we've made some changes, but I want to test this thing out. And I've got my scene. So if you notice, I've got my game scene.sks. I'm going to go in there for a second. Notice that there's a hello world, right? Here's my hello world. And if I was to run this, I want to target iPhone SE and press play. And if everything goes well, it should run. Let's see what I get. Now, funny enough, notice that there's a couple of items in my outline, right? One of them is the scene, and one of them is called hello label. And there it is. There's my hello label. And what you can do with this little app built in from scratch is do one of these. Woohoo, right? Some kind of spinny app. Every time I click on it, it kind of goes in and out. Right, we're going to change this. But this is what this app does right now. Okay, so try this out. It should work the same for you. Let's make a couple of changes here, right? Because we're learning what this thing is all about, okay? And this is stuff that comes right off of the regular things. Notice that, my library has really changed now. I don't have the regular stuff that we had before. We have labels. We have some map nodes. We have a camera. We have a bunch of other things. We're not going to use a lot of this, right now. Like we have navigation graphs. We have different actions. A bunch of other things that you can do here, if you want to drag and drop them. In fact, you can build a whole game with dragging and dropping, but we're not going to do that, of course. We're going to take the hard way of doing things and program everything from scratch, right? I know, you're like, what? How can we program a whole game from scratch? You'll be fine. One thing, let's just change the font. So if I click on Hello Label, and if I go to my, my example here, notice the text is plain and the font is Helvetica. Let's test out our font we just put in there. So I'm going to change this to on the right. If you notice where it says all fonts, I want to skip down to where I can find my Doc51. I just installed this in my system, so it should come up. There's Doc51, right? And then I'm going to click on a size. Now 144 is way too big, so let's choose a smaller size, like something like 64 or 40. Let's choose 48. And it looks really small, but you're going to see why it's okay. So here's 48. Here's Hello World. And there's some problems too, right? Here's some Hello World. But here's something that I want you to note. My scene, if I click on my scene, so this is, I'm on my game scene.sks, and there's two things on my outline, my scene and my hello label. Now, one thing to note about the system we're using is it uses something called SK nodes. SK nodes. SK nodes are SpriteKit nodes, right? I want you to think about each node, it's just a name, for a container. So they're containers. So hello label is an SK node, right? And if you notice, it's inside of the scene node, right? So we can say then that the scene is the parent node of my hello label SK node. That's what it is. So you have this parent and child relationship, okay? It's important to note because whenever we add stuff to the scene, we're going to use something called add child. We're going to add a child to the scene. We can also remove children from the scene as well, all right? Okay, so this is the first thing. So my hello label here. And notice also that if I click on scene, I have a couple of things we're going to talk about in a second. One of them is, if I scroll down, you can see that I have a couple things. One is the color, and then the size. And the size says custom. Okay, that means it works for any generic phone. We don't want that. We want to target specifically my iPhone SE. Let's change this from custom to iPhone SE. For now. Oh man, what the heck happened? It went like this. Why? Because whenever you change the phone, it changes from from portrait to landscape. So let's change it back. And now let's zoom in. And you can see that when we zoom in, hello world at 48 is pretty big. It's not small at all. In fact, let's make the size change from 48, and you can type in another value if you don't like the value that comes. Let's say to 40. And then these are 40 points. Don't think about them as pixels. They're not pixels. They're points. Okay, so there's my hello world. It's a different font. Let's change the font color. So I'm going to click on the hello label again. I'm going to change the font color from white. I want to change it to yellow, right? Just to make it really stand out. Okay, so you guys should have this. Now, what my hope is when we run this thing, it's going to run just like this on our simulator, right? Remember I did all those changes to make it work? Let's try it and make it work here. I haven't changed anything. All we've done is we've used the same hello label, right? And there we go. Notice on the bottom, it has a couple things here. One thing it has is nodes. It gives you some data down here. And I'm going to show you what that is. It gives you the number of nodes. It says 2. What are the 2 nodes? The scene node, which is the parent node, and this node right here, which is the label node, right? So the label, this hello world, is the child node of the scene node. So there's 2. Okay, that's what it says 2. And notice right here, it says I'm running approximately at 59.3 frames per second. That means the screen is refreshing. It's being written to and erased. We talked about this last week, right? You write to it and erase it 60 times a second, right? So that means every 16.66 milliseconds, this screen is going to be wiped and redrawn, right? Now, 60 frames per second is a standard speed for games. You can change the speed here. We're going to try and target 60 frames per second. It really depends on the device if it can support it. All right, so what did we do? All we did was we changed the label And if you don't have this, that means you have to follow the steps that I talked about earlier. If you see some other font, if it's not this, and you see like Helvetica or something else that comes up, that means you didn't follow the steps that I pointed out earlier. Otherwise, the font is not deployed to your machine. All right, this is the first part. So, but it's something that we dragged and dropped in here, right? Like, for example, if I want to, I can take a color sprite. Let's do this together. I'm going to take a color sprite and drag and drop a color sprite into my scene here. And then notice I got these like funky bars. The bars basically try and align this thing so the color sprite appears wherever I want it to be, right? So here I got a color sprite, and let's just assign one of the items that I have in my assets.xc assets. Remember, we added all these images, right? Let's make the plane pop up, right? So we're going to go back to gamescene.sks, and when I click on this little red box that I dragged and dropped from my color sprites into the scene, and I'm going to change the texture from nothing to plane. Let's scroll down. You should see it too. And I click plane. Now I got my little plane. Hey. What the heck is a texture? Well, we talked about that last week. A texture is an image, a bitmap, right? And what it is a bunch of pixels, right? And all we're doing is we're taking that texture, bitmap, image, whatever you want to call it, and we're putting it inside of, or as a property of, the node, this SK node, this sprite node. It's a color sprite to display it on the screen. Okay, if I run this now, how many nodes do you think we're going to have? 3. Okay, I know this is slow. I'm going slow, guys. I'm going slow because you don't get this. You'll never get the other part we're going to do today, right? This is the easy part. Because that's the kind of sprite it is. Create a simple sprite with color, right? So there's other ones, other kinds of things. You can create an empty node if you want to as well. I don't recommend that. That's for other things.
Put the texture into the colors.
And that's what we did. Yeah, I dragged and dropped the color sprite in here, and then I put the texture in here.
But
Right?
you can't do it with the
Not exactly, because then you'd have to convert it to a sprite. So let's talk about this now. And if, okay, so let's try this out. So I'm going to just play. And if I do everything correctly, then you should see the little plane down here. But it's not going to do anything. Like if I do this, in fact, it's still going to do the exact same behavior I did before, right? I just changed my node and I added this other thing. Now take a look at the nodes down here. When I'm doing this, it's actually adding new nodes dynamically. I've got like 54, 58 nodes, sometimes 60 nodes. And if I really spin this around quick enough, I might be able to get 60, maybe, right? And then it's still operating at 60 frames per second. If I let go, then it erases all the nodes, and then I'm back down to 3. My scene, my root node, which is my top level node for the scene, hello world, which is my second node, and then the plane, which is my third node. Okay. Let's talk about coordinate systems. Okay, coordinate systems. So notice here that the coordinate system is on the screen, right? And it says that I've got like 160 points here and about 100 and about, some kind of, but it looks that goes to from 0 to negative 160 and from 0 to 160. In fact, one thing to note is if I click on my scene, there's a little X in the middle. You see this little plus? It's almost like a little, and if I move let's move my my label around. I'm gonna move my label up here so you can see it. See this little plus, right? It looks like a plus, but actually what it is it's an indicator of where the pivot point is, or the central point, the 0, 0 point, the origin for my screen is in the middle. I don't like that. That's weird, right? Actually, Unity does the same thing. It puts the origin in the middle sometimes. However, we can change the origin because it's just wherever we want the origin to be. If I change the origin, that means my coordinate space is changed too, right? So this is 0, 0. And if you notice, if I expand this, I'm just going to collapse this part right now because we don't need it, right? And so we need more room over here. If I click on my, so the background here, this background scene, right? You can see that my anchor point, that's what they call it, this thing right here, is 0.5, 0.5. I want you to think about this as normalized, right? So this point goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is 100% and 0.5 is 50% of the screen, right? So that means that my anchor point on the x-axis is 50% of the width, right? And my anchor point on the y-axis is 50% of the height. And that's where this is right here, okay? I also have some other stuff in here. I have gravity. I'm not going to use physics today, okay? But this has a really cool little physics engine built into it as well. If you really wanted to use physics-based game, like some kind of platformer or whatever. We're not going to make that kind of game. This is not a game course, right? And we have no time. It would take us probably a few weeks to get it right, okay, with particle systems and blah, blah, blah. We're not doing that. I'm just giving you like a, I don't know, a little jolt of electricity to say, maybe you can make games. That's all I'm trying to do here with SpriteKit, to give you an idea of how they're done, all right? And this is native. I'm not using Unity. I'm not using other kinds of stuff. I'm using native iOS, Swift, and SpriteKit to do the game, okay? Okay. So notice that there's a bunch of other information here. And I can do the same thing for my, if I click on my Hello World node, notice it too has a coordinate system. It has, you know, X at 0 and then Y at 114.046. Why is that? Because it's above this part right here, but it's centered. That's why the X is at 0. See the X? And it has its own anchor point. Notice the anchor point down here, right, is here's the position of the rotation, but the anchor point for this thing is also at the 0, 0 mark. Okay, notice it says here position 0, 0, and then this is the X in the Y position. This is the Z position and the rotation. Okay, so the anchor point is important because it tells us where how the node is going to rotate. So if I was to grab this thing and rotate it, I can rotate it any way I want. I can change the rotation of the node to make it look like whatever I want it to look like, right? And that's how it works. That's how the rotation works. But it's a local coordinate system based on the parent system. So if my parent is the 0, 0 points in the middle, my child node is going to base its coordinate system starting at the parent, okay? So in other words, the reason why this is at 114.046 is because it's up 114 points because 0, 0 is right here. Okay. And now this one would be negative at some point, right? Because notice that's at negative 160 because it's 0 on the x-axis and negative down, and it shows you the coordinate right here, negative 160 over here. But that's kind of weird. And typically we don't program games like this. We either use the bottom left corner of the screen if we're going to do it. And I want you to get familiar with how to do this kind of stuff anyway, or the top left corner of the screen, right? It really depends on your preference, right? For this game, I'm going to make it so that we use the top left corner of the screen, okay? So the top left corner is going to be the 0, 0 mark. That means we're going to go and change the background. So I'm going to kind of copy this, go here. And now, how do I change the anchor point? Well, it's negative 0.5. Well, I want to make it 0 on the x-axis. So I want to put 0 here. Let's do this together. Notice how everything moved, right? And then I want to make this, I want to put y as 1, okay? Y is equal to 1. So that's like what the axis point's going to be. Now that's way out there. And if you notice, if I kind of, kind of zoom out now, you can see what it looks like. Hello World is off screen now because it was off screen. It was some negative value, some weird value, right? Now, this is interesting because I want you to pay attention to the numbers here, what it says here. Even though I did this, because I changed this value to 0 as an example here, right, 0 and 0, it doesn't mean that this value here is positive. Oh, sorry, this value here is positive. This value here is still negative. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If I click on this object, it shows you still negative 160 and 0, right? And if I move this, if I can move this around, let's move it to the middle of the screen somewhere down here. You can see that it's now negative 447.5, right? Same thing with I move my hello world. If I move my hello world around, it becomes some kind of negative number. Do I want all my numbers to be negative? So I'm showing you the top left corner so you can understand how it works, right? The answer is no. I don't want my numbers to be negative. That's kind of weird. Every number is negative. I'd rather have every number be positive, right? Because it's easier for me to understand and deal with. So how do I change my, my position on my screen? So here's my background screen again, right? And again, I'll just bring up this little thing so you can see it. If it's hard for you to figure this out, you can click on the scene in the outline, right? And on the right in the inspector right here on the middle, right, where it says show the attributes inspector, which is a little different looking, right? You can see that where the anchor point is 0 and 1. That's 0 and 1. 0 and 1 up, right? So I want it to be 0, but I want it to be -1. And if we did that, if I change this anchor point to -1, and you can see now that, oh man, like I'm in deep trouble, right? Like, where's all my stuff? It's way down here, right? How did that work out? How come 0 and -1 work out down here? How come it went down here and not here? Anyone have an idea? -1, right? And if I was to back this up, like you can see, not -2. If I was to back this up and now it's 0, 0, well, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Because before it was 0.5, 0.5, so it did exactly what I wanted to do. This is truly the 0, 0 point. And what happened was iOS had moved this to this point, 0.5, 0.5. When I moved it to -1, it actually moved all the way down here. And again, you can create your own coordinate system the way you like, but 0, 0 is where we really want to put it. Okay, now we have to adjust these things again. So if I move this up here, right, as an example, and this in the middle, and if I zoom in again, let's just zoom in so we get better coordination in terms of spacing. Okay. By the way, do you think this is going to make a difference in my game? Like, if I run this now, will it make a difference? Let's try it out. So I'm going to kind of do this, press play, and let's see what happens. I just changed the coordinate system. So the coordinates, bottom left corner of the screen. And if I press this one, it still does the same thing, right? Still does the same thing I did before. You should still have the same number of nodes and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So it didn't do anything for me, like visible, but it did do something for me code-wise. Hey, now everything is positive. If I go to the right, it's positive. If I go up, it's positive. It makes sense, right? 0, 0 in the middle, for some new people, it doesn't really make sense. That means negative is down, and you have some weird things all over the place. So we want to kind of see that and this is more like Cartesian math, right? Where the 0, 0 point is at the bottom left corner of the screen. So as I go to the right, you can see now that's 320. And as I go up, it's 480, positive 480. 320 by 480, standard, old school, iPhone device. But this isn't reasonable, right? No one has a 320 by 480 phone. That's like an iPhone 4, right? So you want to go into something more reasonable. And the most reasonable phone right now is the iPhone 6 or 6S, not the Plus. That's an expanded phone. And so there's some issues with that. So let's change this again one more time before we move on. So go back to the background. So I'm clicking on the scene. And instead of iPhone SE, let's change it to the iPhone 6S. Okay, cool. So now it becomes a different orientation. And now we're still portrait. This is good. I want to also change my target. So instead of having my emulator or my simulator, where it is right now, I'm going to quit my simulator for a second. And I'm going to retarget my simulator for an iPhone 6S. Here's my iPhone 6S. You can also choose an iPhone 8. Same. Okay. Now, if I center everything, it's going to be slightly different, right? It's going to be slightly different. I can't quite get the center of sometimes, but you can see that I have a lot more space. And this would be what I would normally look like. That means this game is primarily going to be played on an iPhone 6 or up, because that's, for the most part, that's where most devices sit right now, around that size, iPhone 6 and up. There's lots more iPhone 6s than there are iPhone 4s at this point in time, right? Since we've been recording this. Let's try this now and see what the difference is. So we've switched iPhones as well. So I'm launching my iPhone 6, and we should see that when we launch the app, it should work fairly similarly to what we had before, with very little motion. Now, so far, and I'm waiting for the simulator, so I'll keep talking. So far, what we've seen is we can drag and drop stuff. But guys and girls, we don't normally drag and drop stuff to make applications unless we're using something like Unity. I'm going to use Unity or Unreal, then I might have a scenario where I drag and drop my scene together. Here, I'm not going to do that. I want to program my scene from scratch, right? I want to be able to do everything with code. Sure, you can drag and drop some of the stuff, but there's going to be some stuff you're going to have to program anyway. So you might as well program everything from scratch. First of all, let's not do that yet. I want to get a reference. I want to get a reference to move this node a little higher. So I want to talk about how to get a reference for the nodes we drag and drop. We may have to do some of the drag and dropping here, right? We'll see how it goes. So one thing to note is, where is the programming all done, right? Well, we know that we have a gamescene.sks file. That's this file. That's the scene. And we also have a gamescene.swift file. And that is the code behind file. And this is where we have all this extra stuff happening, where we have this label, which is an SKLabel node, and some kind of spinny node that does that spinny shape when we touch the screen and all that stuff. We want to get rid of all this stuff because that doesn't make any sense. Let's just get rid of it. We're going to get rid of this. And anything that has that label stuff, like inside of our override function didMove. DidMove is like a view did load. That's what it's like for our scene. Okay, so we're going to get rid of all this stuff, right? Everything that, including spinny nodes and all this kind of stuff, we're going to get rid of all of it. I think up until right to the end here. We can't get rid of all the things, but it has to be at least this much. So our didMove to looks like this now. And in our touchdown, there's some touches. Again, if you have anything that has to do with, your spinny nodes, like this spinny node right here, get rid of it. We don't care about the spinny node. Okay, so touches can be clean here. Same thing with this spinny node here, because we don't care about this. Get rid of all this stuff. So now it's not going to do any of this stuff, right? Because we don't have any of that stuff working. And now we have touches began. This is where it detects if there's any touches on the screen. So we don't really care about the label. And so we're going to get rid of that only, right? So we're just going to get rid of this label here. We're going to get rid of this. The rest, I think, is okay. All right, so we have nothing on the screen now. Nothing at all. Okay, I'm going to get rid of some of these comments too because we don't need them for now, just to make it easier for you guys to see. Okay. So didMove, this is interesting. This is where we can establish kind of a reference to the nodes we have on the screen. Okay, so if I suggest that I make a, I want to make a reference to my hello label, let's call this hello label, right? Which is of type what? What kind of node is that? SK node, right? Here's my hello label, which is an SK node type. Right? Now there's different kinds, right? There's an SK Sprite node, and there's also an SKLabel node, right? So let's make it what it is, an SKLabel node. Also, it won't be right. I mean, what we say is it's an SK node, right? Right, it's an SK node, and then we want to find with a name, that's what it has to be. We have to find this thing that has a name. So SK node with name, because we want to kind of target it with, that's inside the code, right? Because this is on the code itself, right? So this SKLabel node, we have to make a reference to it, but there is no name. We haven't put a name yet. So before we do this, let's get back to scene. And on the scene itself, if you click on the hello label, notice on the right-hand side, it's got to have this hello label. If you don't have this hello label in here, it will never look right. And let's just, because we're here, let's change this SK Sprite node right here. Let's change this one to plain. Yep. So plain and hello label. Going back to this code here. So we want to find a way, to change to kind of find the node on the screen, which is an SK node. So SK node, right? And it's not just an SKLabel node, it's an SK node. And if I open up the brackets, right? And with a file named in a string, SK node file name, and the string is going to be called what we talked about before, which is hello label. And now it's a string, so it's put in there, hello label. That's what it's expecting. Now, because we said it's an SKLabel node, and we say it's an SK node, we need to cast it, right, as a SKLabel node. So we're going to take the first fix. And that is going to be getting a reference to the object itself. Okay, that's how we get a reference to the object. Okay, let's review this again one more time, right? So we have our hello label. We named it hello label. We did this in our didMove method, right? We could have done it somewhere else too. And then we said that, well, it's of type SKLabel node. That's what we said first. And then we said, well, okay, it's equal to a reference to this SK node with a file named hello label. Okay, interesting. As SKLabel node, we're casting it again. Now, if we did this right, then I should be able to do something like this. I should say, well, hello label, dot position dot x, right? Remember, there's also other options, dot x. We could say is equal to 0. Let's put this at the 0 point. Now, if I put that at 0, and where it is right now, it'll go, the x will go right down to the ground. So it'll be like right at the base of the whole thing. I'm moving it right away. So wherever it was, I don't care. I'm just moving it down. Okay. There is a problem with this, and I believe I have to use self.child node. Let me just try this again. Self.child node with name. Let's use that one instead. Self.child node with name. Sorry, let's try this again. We'll call this hello label. Because we haven't made our label. We're gonna do that. We're gonna do that when we have an object first. Okay, so there we go. And we have to cast it again as an SKLabel node. Because it's, it's the reason why we use self is because it's a child node of the view. It's already there, right? We're not making it. All right, so I want to move this down here. Let's try this out and see what happens. So I'm going to run this thing. And if I'm right, then when we launch our application, the hello label is going to be right at the bottom of the screen. Half of it's going to be cut off. Okay, let's see if that's right. So we're launching it if there's no problems. And if everything goes well, then, okay, whoa, what happened? Oh, well, it was the other way around. It wasn't at the bottom of the screen. It was at the left part of the screen. If I want it to be at the bottom of the screen, what would I have to do here? Y, right? So let's try this, change this from X to Y, right? By the way, there's other ways to do this, but let's just do this for now. And if I run this thing again, then I should see in my simulator that it's going to be right at the bottom of my screen, like this half cut off. So what did I do? I used a reference, to get a link to the label that was on the screen, right? And then I changed the Y coordinate position of the label based on the current pivot point all the way to the bottom of the screen. Okay, if I can do that, that means I can move things all over the place. If I can move things all over the place, I have a game. First part of the game, right? But, and this is cool, and let's do the same thing just to give you a sense of that. How would I do my plane now? I want to get my plane, I want to make a reference to it. How do I do that? What do I type? Okay, we'll call this the plane, and then notice that it came up, eh? I said plane, and then all of a sudden it came up with the plane, right? Let my plane, not cloud, plane, right? What type is it? Is it an SK node or what? SK Sprite node, right? So that's what it is, SK Sprite node. So if I start typing Sprite node, that's what it is. So that's the type it is. We don't want, Swift to implicitly try and figure out what it is. It's not going to figure it out. All right. And then we're going to say like a self meaning the view dot child node with name, which is equal to plain, right? And then we get a reference to that object. Okay, we got a reference now. We have to cast it, right? Because it's not a child node only. It's a special type of child node. It's an SK node, right? Which is of type SpriteKit, SK Sprite node. And that's what we have to change. Because this is a SKLabel node. This is a SK Sprite node. All right? Cool. Okay, now let's move the plane around and let's move it higher up. So now there's another way to move it. We can say that the plane dot position, right, is equal to, this is different, a new CG float, or a CG point, let's say. You can do that, where you have a couple of points. Let's use the X and Y. There's a couple of overloads, right, where we have a point that's going to be something like 100 and 100, right, wherever that is. So that's another way to move the plane, right? We can move it to a specific position on the screen based on X and Y coordinates, okay? And if I was to run this, we should still see the hello label at the bottom of the screen and the plane somewhere else. Let's see. There we go, 100, 100. Now, for you to figure this out in the screen, this is about right. Why is this 100, 100? Well, let's take a look at our map, right? If I go to my game scene.sks, and if I go look at it, it's 100 up, something like around here, right? And 100 over, approximately around here. So it's going to be somewhere in here, right? Something like this in this coordinate space right here. Close to where we had it. Just to prove this out, I'm just going to move this over here like this on this side here, just so you see that it's going to move down here again, right? And you're going to see already the hello world move down there. Let's try it out one more time. It should still be the same. Like you should still see the plane right here. See, even though it was way up here. So we have total control over where the plane is, where the label is, and this is good, right? Because this gives us our coordinate. We understand our coordinate space. We understand how we lay things out with SpriteKit. We're already adding nodes to the scene, but we're doing it by dragging and dropping. And guys and girls, dragging and dropping, we almost never do. I never drag and drop to make a game, right? We program a game from scratch. So now we're talking something totally different. And this is the first part of the new stuff. So where am I going to go with this today and next week? I'm going to build separate classes. I'm going to build a plane class. I'm going to build an island class, an ocean class, a cloud class. We're going to have sounds for this game. I'm going to build an array of clouds that are going to go through. I'm going to create a colliding system where I can detect the collision between one object and the other. And we're going to do this over a couple weeks, right? It's not going to be just done all today. We just don't have the time. And there's too much information for you guys. You're going to be like, oh my God, my head's going to explode, right? It's a lot. But once you get through this system, then you'll know the basics of how to make a 2D game on any system, okay? And then we'll be done with games. Because we've done a couple of weeks, and then we'll move on to some other framework. All right, so this is cool. I like it, but it's not really productive. I know it's kind of cold, eh? You guys cold? You guys close the window yet? All right. I know it's hot in here, but it's not that hot. All right. See, now you were complaining that it was too cold. No, it really is too cold, right? Yeah, so this is the first part. So part two, let's go to the actual scene here. So this is one, right? I want to leave this like this for a second, okay? Before we touch anything, I want to leave this like this. There's a reason for this. How about when I start my scene? I have sometimes when we play games, we have a menu or some kind of start scene. We have the gameplay scene, and then we have the end scene. How do I make more than one scene happen in the game, right? So if you look at the game view controller, remember we haven't talked about this. We've talked about the game scene.sks and the game scene.swift. There's also a game view controller.swift. So if you go there, you can see that in the view did load function, and I'm just going to erase all this other stuff because we don't need it for now. In the view did load function, you can see that there is a section that says, hey, if the view is a SK view, that's what it's basically saying, then create a new scene called game scene. And there it is, right? It's looking at game scene. So in order for us to make a new scene ourselves, we need to create a new scene. Also notice that it includes some FPS. So those little things, the little numbers at the bottom of the scene, this is where we show it. And when we finally complete the game, we'll take them out. We won't show those things because you don't see frame rate at the bottom of your screen typically when you play the game, right? So for now, we'll leave it in so we can see the performance, what the performance is. And there's a different aspect fill. Right now, it's aspect fill. Now, this is okay for an iPhone 6. But what if you go to an iPhone 4, right? And we can play around with this. This is where we can play around with the aspect so we can change the size. So sometimes what we want to do is scale to fit so that if it's a big game, it'll scrunch down. You might have a letterbox happening at the top and the bottom. I prefer that than stretching. I don't want to stretch my game because then it's going to look weird, right? So aspect fill is wrong for our game typically, right? We want to make sure it fits. And you can change that. Let's try this out now. Now, again, it's up to you. Some developers don't mind. But you can see that aspect fit. If I go aspect fit instead of aspect fill, it's going to try and fit my game to the screen. So if I was to run this now the way it is, you should not see any changes because we made an iPhone 6 game and it's for an iPhone 6. But if I change this thing, instead of an iPhone 6, if I go to an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 8, it's going to try and fit it in as best as possible. Right? And that's why some games are made specifically for a phone and some games are made specifically for an iPad, right? You try and load an iPhone game on an iPad, and you can do that, right? You'll see some kind of bars. It'll look stretched. It'll look weird, right? But you can do it if you want. Okay. So this worked okay. So I'm going to leave it as aspect fit. I think that's better for us. And the other thing is I want to make a new game scene. So this is the game scene. I want to make a start scene. And I want to make an end scene. Let's make a start scene first. So how do I do it? I'm going to right-click on this little folder here, right? And I'm going to say new file. And I want you to scroll all the way down until you get to SpriteKit scene, right? And click next. And I'm going to call this start scene, right? And press create. Now, remember what we talked about? I'm just going to move it up so you can see it. So there's my scene. And what else can I do here? I mean, this is cool, right? I have these little separators, right? But I can make other ones, right? I can make a new folder or some kind of new group. Let's make a new group, right? As an example, here's my new group. And let's call this scenes, right? So here's my scenes. And I can nicely organize it. I can take my game scene and put it in there. It doesn't really matter, right? Does it matter? Is anything going to happen outside of the operating system? No. It's just for you. It's just organization for your application. And I fully encourage you to do this kind of stuff when it comes to organizing your application. So if I don't want to look at scenes, I don't have to look at them anymore, right? They're all inside of there. I also have a start scene, so I'm going to put that in there. There's my start scene. So now they're at the top. But what is my start scene missing? It doesn't have the Swift part. I need two parts. I need the scene, the SKS file, and I need the Swift file. It's like the SKS file is my storyboard, right? That's what it's like. And I'm really creating a state system, a state manager. That's what my game view controller is. My game view controller is like a state machine. It starts off with one menu and then allows me to do something else. All right. Well, this is cool. So here's my start scene. And what I want to do with my start scene when I come here is, again, I need to create another file. One thing to note is if I look at the right, my start scene doesn't start off the way the other one did. Notice that my game scene started with black and it has all these settings. I have to do all that again. So I've got to go here. I got to go to the settings. My anchor point's got to be 0, 0. Please do this with me now. 0, 0, right? My background color should be black. So it looks a little bit the same. My size should be iPhone 6S. That's important. And make sure it's portrait, not landscape. All the same things we did for our other scene. There we go. That's how it has to be. If you don't do this, and if you let it be whatever it's going to be, it's not going to look right. It's going to be gray. Okay? So again, we're just showing you how to go from one scene to the other. That's number one. 2, I need the other part, or else this isn't going to even work. Okay? So how do I get it? I'm going to, again, I'm just going to right click right on top of this thing and go new file. And then instead of getting this scene again, I already got this part. I want to get a Cocoa Touch class. Okay, I'm going to click next. And this time I want to put in SK scene in here. That's what I want. It's going to inherit from SK scene. Right? And my class is going to be the same name as my SKS file. So it's going to be start scene. But it's going to inherit from SK scene. SK SpriteKit. Just the name of the library. Okay, and then next. It's going to attach it. I'm going to click create. And what this is going to do is going to add a new start scene with nothing in it, but we have a bit of a problem because it's importing UIKit, and I don't need UIKit, I need SpriteKit. All right, so I've got SpriteKit, I've got my SK scene, and if I wanted to modify what this looks like, remember that each scene starts with a did move. I need that did move part. And I have a bunch of touch events that I could choose to use or not, right? So if I go back to my start scene and if I put, move, did move, if I start typing did move, and I can override this function as an example, and then we'll just say, we'll just do a print for now that says start scene. Right, so we'll print it when it's launched. Here's my SpriteKit. Nice, we've got both parts, but we need to connect them. Right, so SKS got to be connected to Swift. Right now, they're not connected. They're just made. Right, so I'm going to go back to my SKS file. And if you notice here, I have these other options. This one is the one that I want. And notice that my custom class, it's of type SK scene. I'm just going to put in start scene. Now, my SKS file is linked to my start scene. That's what it's doing, right? So this one is linked to this one. Okay, let's just use a simple label again. So we'll get a label. We'll put back another label in here. There it is, somewhere in the middle. And we'll change the label. We'll call it start, some kind of start label. So I'm gonna click here, go back to here. We'll give it a name. So we'll say the start label. Maybe we'll call it the welcome label. How about that? Welcome label. And okay, the text is plain and the title is label. We'll say, welcome for now. We'll change this later. We'll change the color to yellow if we can, right? So I want to change the color to yellow. By the way, you can choose either these colors, you can choose these colors, you can choose the crayons, you can pick one, here's the crayons. I want to pick some kind of yellow, banana, or lemon, or whatever you want. All these would work for you, no problem, right? So if I want to pick a specific color, I can do it. I can also type it in. And how do I make yellow? Red, green, and blue. How do I make yellow from red, green, and blue? Red and green, right? So there's my yellow, all red and all green, right? And that's the one I want. So I change the color. And you can also change the text. So instead of making Helvetica, we'll change our text that we already have on our screen by going to all fonts, and I'll change to Doc51, which is a different kind of font. Right? I'll make it so it's 40, like let's say 40 again, because that worked last time. I think anything larger is probably going to be too big. Welcome. We can figure that out if we want to use another size, if that's too small. Okay, so we want to do that right there. Welcome. So we know that that's there. Okay, and we know that there's a font. And here's my welcome label. And I can get a reference to the welcome label. So let's just do that just for posterity. We're not going to do anything with it right now, because we're going to change this later. So we have to start scene, and let's do the same thing. So let our welcome label be of type, again, SKLabel node, right, which is equal to self.child node with name of welcome label, right? We're just making a reference, and it has to be of type as, if I click away, it's going to give me that error, right? As an SKLabel node, right? Because we have to kind of cast it so that it maintains everything we need. Okay, and if we did everything correctly, it should start there. Okay. Now, let's change it. So we're going to go to my game view controller. Take a look. My game view controller starts the game scene. We want to change this to start scene. I'm pointing this out because I need to do this later on. We won't probably need to do it now, but I'll show you too. When I start scene, and if I press play, then you should see the welcome label come up first in the middle of the screen. Welcome, there it is. But I can't get to my second scene, right? It's black screen, I can't get to it. How do I go forward? Well, I want to, do the touches, right? So when my touches begin, when I touch something, I want to move from one scene to the other scene. Now there's a problem. And the problem is there's a couple ways we can do this touches thing. I want you to think of it like this. And there's method to my madness here, okay? Whenever we do this kind of thing. The way this works is that there's an overlay. You can't see it, but the game view controller overlays and is active throughout the entire time, okay? So right now, if notice that it has something built into it called, or it doesn't have it here, but there's a touches that I could do. Touches began, right? So this would work. What I really want to do is I want to make a new scene, just like this. I want to change the scene scale mode. In fact, I want to grab all this stuff, right? All this stuff here. When I touch my screen, I know this is true. I don't have to worry about this. But when I touch my scene, I want to do this part right here. That's what I want. And I want to change it from start scene to game scene. That's what I want. Okay, I want you to think about, how do I do this? Well, let's go back to this. And if I go to my start scene, first of all, let's take a look at game scene. Game scene has some built-in functions we didn't use. One of them is touches begin, right? Touches began, right? So right now it doesn't do anything. Just touches began. For T and touches, self.touchdown at point T.location in self. That's all it does. Notice it overrides the function touches began, but does not return anything, right? So that's what I want. I want this touches began thing happening, right? And I can override it because, hey, look, I have it here, right? It says I can use my touches began to move it, and it's part of my SK scene, so I should be able to do it here. Now, there's going to be a problem, but I'm just pointing it out to you guys so you can see it, so you're not going to be freaked out about it when it happens. All right. So let's do it. So I'm going to go back into my class, and I'm going to start typing touches began, right? There's my touches began. And I want to make that new scene. So if I go back just to get some code, I'm going to go back to my game view controller, and I'm going to do this, right? Instead of if let scene, right, kind of thing. I mean, I could do this. All this is trying to get is a name, right? This is a safe way of doing it. So I'm just going to grab this part right here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back to my start scene .swift, and inside where it says touches began, I'm going to put it in there. And instead of start scene, right, and this is the problem. And instead of start scene, right here, we're going to call it game scene. Now, there's a bit of an issue. It says, hey, you didn't unwrap it. Did you mean to use this or this or this? And let's fix it, just like choose a fix. So we try this, right? We're going to say, well, my view, you know, or whatever, view.present scene. Well, we can actually use self here, if you think about it, right? Because the view is the self, right? This is the view. For now, let's just do it this way and see what happens, right? So I want to wait till I touch the screen, and then when I touch the screen, it should take me to the game scene. Should it? Let's see what happens. All right, so let's run it. So I'm going to run this thing, and if it loads properly and it doesn't crash, then we bring this up, and if I click on the screen somewhere, bam, we're in the next scene. So I've moved from one scene to the other. Okay, why am I showing you this? I need a start scene, I need a play scene, and I need a game over scene. So when I die, I need to go and say, it's going to say game over, right? And that's why I'm showing you this. Now, notice that there was no transition. It was like went from one scene to the other right away. And I don't want that. That's messed up, right? So what I want to do is I can not only present scene, but I can do something else. Let's try this out, guys. So instead of presenting scene, I can go something like this. I can say dot present scene, but I can present scene with a transition. All right, here's the transition. This one for people who are watching, right? So I want to do present scene, but it's SK scene with transitions. So I'm going to call this scene. And this one is going to be SK transition. I'm just going to type this again, SK transition, right? Dot. There's different kinds of transitions. I can do doors close horizontal, some weird transitions, a fade. I want to do a crossfade. It's one of the most common ways to do it. And the time interval is going to be 1.0 seconds. So it's going to take 1 second for me to crossfade from one scene to the other, right? Very straightforward so far. Okay, so all I'm doing is presenting the scene. That's how I show the next scene. So first, I declare the scene. I create an object of type SKScene, and I make it so whatever the file is, I get a reference to that. I allocate the aspect fit, as opposed to aspect fill. Aspect fit gives me the bars if it's too small or too big. It tries to fill it as best as possible proportionately. It does not stretch, which is good. And then I say, hey, whatever the view is, present the scene from the view, right? And what I want to do is I want to transition from one scene to the other. Now, there is a problem here, right? What is the parent scene if I'm transitioning from the game scene? It's the start screen, right? And if I transition from the game scene to the end scene, and then I go back, kind of weird. And this is where we can run into problems later. We'll deal with this later on. But I want to point it out because it's, remember how the storyboard works, right? Scenes are always there, right? You don't swap them out typically. And so too, there's going to be some kind of issues when we do this later on. All right, so sometimes what we can do to fix this, and we'll talk about it later, is we might use the main storyboard to control our scene with buttons. We'll see how that works. Okay, but for now, we're good. So let's try this out and see if it works. I'm just going to run this thing, and then we'll take a short break. It's 8:04. We've been running for about an hour and a bit. People are going crazy, and some people are tired. I can see people sleeping. Hi. And then if I click on this, you can see that it crossfades, which is pretty cool, right? Crossfade works okay. And then we can go from one scene to the other. Okay, any questions around so far we've covered in SpriteKit? So just to recap, SpriteKit, very simple. It's made up of a series of nodes. Think about a node as a container. The containers can contain child nodes, a child of the other node. And I can actually set that up both drag and drop. So if I go back to one of these scenes, let's say, for example, the gameplay scene, right now the hello label is separate from plane. But what I can do is I can take the plane and I can make it so that it is a child of the hello label, right? And if I did that, if I move the hello label, so too is the plane move around, right? Because now the plane is a child of the hello label, which is a child of the scene node, right? But we don't want that. Okay, so what the first thing about is that. Also, we have extra files we never had before, right? We have some files. We have a game view controller.swift, which is different than a regular view controller.swift, right? In that it has different functionality, right, than we normally have. On top of that, we have a couple of new files. One that's an SKS file, which is almost like where the game, almost like a canvas. That's really what it is. It's a canvas where we're going to play our game, the SKS file. This is where the game is going to show up. And then there's the code behind file that controls what's going to be on the canvas, the logic behind the game. And that is the .swift file, which has the same name as the SKS file. Okay, once you have those pieces in place, we're almost ready to make a game. Right now, we only have a couple labels. We can have buttons in there too if you really want to, a bunch of other stuff. Okay, any questions around this? Pretty simple. Pretty simple. All right, let's take a short break. And when we come back, let's actually start coding our game. Okay.